Hello class, welcome to week 3. Dr. Nemecek here with chapters 3 and 4. Our emphasis last week, the second week of the course, was talking about external environmental analysis and what that entailed and trying to help define what it is to know what the outside environment can do to your business. And as such, you need to take that into consideration when you're doing strategic planning for your organization. So before you sit down to actually do a strategic plan, you need to analyze what's going on outside your organization and take a look at the demographics and all the people that you work with outside that can have an impact and influence on your organization from a strong business point of view. This week we'll begin with chapter 3, which talks about service area competitor analysis. And there are, let's see, 8 chapter objectives that you need to be aware of in studying this chapter. The authors want us to understand the importance of service area competitor analysis as well as its purpose. They want you to understand the relationship between general and healthcare environment issue identification and analysis and service area competitor analysis. 3, they want you to define and analyze the service area for a healthcare organization or specific health service. 4, they would like you to be able to conduct a service area structure analysis for a healthcare organization. The 5th objective is be able to understand strategic groups and be able to map competitor strategies along important service and market dimensions. And remember that last week we got into the mapping issue. I'm going to do some more of that this week. Objective 6, understand the elements of service area competitor analysis and assess likely competitor strategies. 7, aggregate and general environment and healthcare industry issues with service area and competitor issues and synthesize specific strategy applications. And last, number 8 learning objective is be able to suggest several questions to help initiate strategic thinking. So with that, we jump right into what the focus of a service area competitive analysis should be all about. And this is what we're going to be discussing the next 2 slides. If you're going to look at your service area competitive analysis, try to determine what that is, there are some things that you need to know that will make it easy and very important for you to hone in that focus on what it is that you should be trying to learn. First of all, they tell you that it's very important to avoid surprises in the marketplace. That's one of the reasons why you're doing this, is because as you sit down and you draw out your strategic plan, you actually reduce this to writing and you get ready to implement it a couple of months down the road. If you have any surprises that do crop up in the marketplace that you had not identified, well, obviously that's not going to be good. Of course, you should have the ability to turn on a dime and make adjustments to those surprises that they do occur, but obviously the best thing to do is to avoid them in the first place. When you're doing a service area competitive analysis, you should be able to provide a forum for leaders to discuss and evaluate their assumptions about the organization's capabilities, market position, and competition. We're talking about the people that work for you in your organization. You should be able to make everyone aware of significant and formidable competitors to whom the organization must respond. You must be able to help the organization learn from rivals through benchmarking, that is, specific measures comparing the organization with its competitors on a set of key variables. Next, you want to be able to build consensus among executives on the organization's goals and capabilities, thus increasing their commitment to the chosen strategy. Next, you want to be able to foster strategic thinking throughout the organization, identify market niches and discontinuities, select a viable strategy that's going to work for all of you, contribute to successful implementation of the strategy, anticipate competitors' moves, and lastly, shorten the time required to respond. In other words, your counter moves to a competitor's moves. So if you see that people are doing something out there differently that's going to have a negative impact on your organization, you should be able to turn on a dime and have a counter move that's going to help to adjust to their market moves as well. Now, as with everything that we do, there are going to be obstacles to our analyzing our service area competitors, and we need to be aware of things that can happen to us that may be a problem in helping us to come up with that analysis. For example, misjudging the industry and service area boundaries for which we are serving. If you don't have a good idea of who the people are that are your geographic niche, your target audience that you're going for and trying to sell your products, goods, and services, obviously that misjudging your industry and service area boundaries could have a negative effect on your strategic plan. And then what that boils down to is poor identification of competition. You've got to make sure that you know who your competition is, and you have to identify all of them accordingly. By the same token, if you overemphasize your competitors' visible competence, that could be a problem for you too, giving them too much credit for what they're doing, and overemphasizing on where rather than how to compete with them. Those are big things that you need to make sure you've got a handle on too, because you don't want to give too much credit to people that on the surface might look like they are a strong and serious competent competitor to your organization, when in reality they may just be someone who's coming up in the business arena that may be new and may not have the ability to do things the way that your company does. Also, you don't want to make faulty assumptions about your competition, and for sure, you don't want to paralyze your organization by the analysis process. In other words, doing nothing but sitting in meeting after meeting after meeting and not making any determination as to what it is that you want to do in your strategic plan. And of course, that goes back to what we're just talking about. Don't give credit to where credit is not due. Make sure that you accurately identify your competition and don't misjudge the industry in which you're working. In other words, your service area boundaries or your geographic location. Make sure that you're spot on. Now, in your textbook, the author has some very good exhibits there that you need to take a look at that will help you to kind of better understand the topic of what they're pointing to in Chapter 3. There's one that's labeled Service Area Competitor Analysis, and it goes from essentially number 1 through number 8, I think is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different strategies where you define the service categories, define the service area, create a service area profile, conduct service area structure analysis, conduct competitor analysis, then map your strategic groups and synthesize your analysis after you're said and done. So give that some thought and read about that exhibit that they have outlined in Chapter 3. They also portray that for you in another way by looking at 5 forces that indicate the viability of a product or service that you are trying to sell as part of your organization. And that exhibit is labeled Services Analysis, 5 Forces that Indicate the Viability of a Product or Service. And what they are is it starts with potential threats, and then goes to buyers, and goes to substitutes, and goes to suppliers. And it all revolves around your rivalries that exist amongst your existing competitors in your geographic region. And when you're talking about potential entrants, those are threats of new entrants or customers, competition coming into your geographic area that are going to cause you a problem. You also have to be aware that when looking at these 5 forces, if they have any bargaining power with the buyers that you do business with, that may have some hurtful outcomes to you, because if they're actually able to buy products, goods, and services at a better price and pass it on to their consumers, that may be something that will hurt your organization, and your patients are the ones going to be the ones to suffer, and eventually you will, because you can't compete with somebody that is undercutting your costs. Threat of substitute products or services. Always be aware that when your rivalries out there are able to provide substitute products or services that may look better than things that you're offering as a healthcare organization, people may gravitate to that type of an approach too, and like what they're doing better. So be aware that if these things exist out there, you need to know what they are, be able to put them on paper, identifying your strategic plan, that these are things that you want to do an analysis of and make sure that you understand what it is that your competitors are doing with that by selling those types of products and services. And last but not least are your suppliers. The same way as a bargaining power of buyers, you have to have bargaining power of suppliers. Essentially, it works the same way. You have to be able to provide the best cost for the products, goods, and services that you're able to supply to your patient base. And again, the best way to know whether or not you're doing that is to know what your competition is doing. So again, a real good exhibit that you should be aware of and read about how that pertains to analyzing what's happening in your geographic region. Now, those Porter's 5 forces, they lay out for you again in another exhibit. listed as 1 through 5 as threats of new entrants, level of rivalry among existing organizations, threats of substitute products and services, bargaining power of buyers, and number 5, bargaining power of suppliers. So make sure that you take some time to read about those exhibits as they're presented in Chapter 3. Now, your authors bring to your attention that of those 5 forces that we were talking about just a minute ago, they can be considered to be, there are things that are considered to be about them that are favorable as well as unfavorable. So let's talk about what the favorable ones are. Those 5 forces might be little or friendly competition. They might be difficult for new competitors to enter the business, which is going to be a benefit to you. There may be few or no good substitutes for products or services that your healthcare organization is offering your patient base. Buyers will not control the price, quality, design, or volume. That's something that you're going to be able to negotiate as someone who is buying from them. And your suppliers will not control the inputs to production. In other words, you do have the ability to buy what you want to help with your price, quality, design, and the volume of the products, goods, and services that as an organization you're going to be selling to your customer base, who are your patients. Just because you have buyers and suppliers who are trying to sell you certain things doesn't necessarily mean that they can control those prices, the quality, design, or the volume of them, or necessarily input to your production by using those things that you're buying from them. So you need to be aware of that as long as you are buying from particular suppliers, you could be in the driver's seat by being a good negotiator and trying to find the best price available from any buyers or suppliers out there of which products, goods, and services are being made available to you. Now, just like those things being favorable or working into your favor as an organization, there are things that can be just as unfavorable. And this again relates to the 5 forces that we were talking about. Be aware that a great deal or a very unfriendly competition can exist, just the opposite of what we said in the last topic slide, which said that there can be very little competition. Well, there can be a great deal of competition, and they might be very unfriendly to your cause. Be aware also that it may be easy for those new competitors to enter the business because maybe you're making it easy for them to take your business away. Be aware that many good substitutes for products or services do exist out there or can exist. And sometimes, if you allow it to, the buyers and suppliers can in fact control price, quality, design, or volume, and inputs to production. So again, it all depends on whether or not you are a good negotiator and you have the ability to do business with people that is favorable to your organization. In other words, getting the best price for the things that you are trying to buy. Strategic thinking questions that help you to validate the strategic assumptions. Now, this is another exhibit that the authors have put in Chapter 3. There are 6 questions that they want you to be aware of. I take that back. There is a total of 11 of them that you should be aware of, that are things that you should be thinking about that will help you to determine whether or not the strategic assumptions you have made by doing this analysis internally of your organization and looking at your service area that you're working in. You should have these 11 things in your mind as you move through this process. Number 1, is the strategy consonant with the competitive environment? Number 2, do we have an honest and accurate appraisal of the competition? Number 3, have we underestimated the competition? Number 4, has the rivalry in the service area category service area changed? Number 5, have the barriers to enter the service category or service area changed? 6, does the strategy leave us vulnerable to the power of a few major customers? 7, have there been any change in the number or attractiveness of substitute products or services? 8, is the strategy vulnerable to a successful strategic counterattack by competitors? 9, does the strategy follow that of a strong competitor? 10, does the strategy pit us against a powerful competitor? And 11, is our market share sufficient to be competitive and generate an acceptable profit for our organization? So remember, those are the things that you want to be asking yourself, 11 questions that will kind of bring the whole process of strategically analyzing your service area. If you're able to answer these 11 questions without a problem, you probably have a pretty good answer, pretty good handle on what it is that you are doing relative to putting down on paper in a strategic plan how you're going to be doing business in the future in your service area. In conclusion, the terms, they also have a block of terms there that I want you to become familiar with relative to the definition of these terms. Things like competitive analysis, competitor analysis, critical success factors, mapping competitors, service area competitor analysis, service area profile, service area structural analysis, service category, strategic groups, and strategic response. Take a look at all those terms and make sure that you've got a good handle on what those terms mean, because if you do, it will give you a good feeling about what it is that you're studying in Chapter 3, and you'll be able to understand it a lot better. So anyway, that takes us to the next topic, and that's going to be Chapter 4 in your textbook, which talks about internal environmental analysis and competitive advantage. Now, there are also 6 learning objectives in Chapter 4 that you need to be aware of. Number 1, be able to understand the role of internal environmental analysis in identifying the basis for sustained competitive advantage. 2, be able to describe the organizational value chain, including the components of the service delivery and support activities. 3, be able to understand the ways in which value can be created at various places in the organization with the aid of the value chain. Number 4, learning objective, use the value chain to identify organizational strengths and weaknesses. Number 5, determine the competitive relevance of each strength and weakness with the aid of a series of carefully formulated questions. And number 6, describe how competitively relevant strengths and weaknesses can be used to suggest strategic actions. So, looking back to week 1, where we talked about the entire process of developing a strategy to put down on paper, we started out by talking about the external environment and doing an analysis of that. Those are the things that we should do to be competitive, and the way we look at that external environment and analyze it will help us to come up with strategies for our own organization. Now we're looking at the internal environment versus the external, and these are the things that we can do. Again, helping us to strategize for the organization what it is that is going to make us successful. So, again, versus the external analysis that we looked at last week, this week we're looking at an internal analysis, taking a look at ourselves inside, and we're going to ask ourselves these questions. Whereas the external analysis asks, what should we do? The internal analysis addresses, what can we do? And as part of this process, we want to identify our strengths, which are competitive advantages, and identify our weaknesses, which are competitive disadvantages. That's what we're ultimately trying to do by doing an internal analysis. Excuse me. Now, be able to do, in order to conduct this internal analysis, we need to be able to identify current and potential competitive advantages. We're going to be taking a look at our resources, our competencies, and our capabilities. When we take a look at our resources, the view should be taking a look at what we consider to be valuable to our organization, what's expensive or difficult to copy resources, and non-human factors that may come into play relative to competition. Our competencies, we'll take a look at the knowledge and skill base that our human factors bring to bear within our organization. In other words, do we have good employees that are going to help us to present a good competitive advantage to the geographic area that we're servicing? As far as our competencies go, we want to make sure that they are socially complex and require large numbers of people engaged in coordinated activities. Because if we include everybody that works within the organization that's able to contribute to this strategic plan and helps us to analyze our competitive advantage, obviously that's going to give us an edge over our competition. And lastly, we want to take a look at our capabilities. These are our organization's ability to deploy resources and competencies to produce its capability. So again, be able to identify current and potential competitive advantage by looking at your resources, your competencies, and your capabilities. Now, as in the other chapters of your textbook, the authors also have put some good exhibits in Chapter 4. And one of them talks about the strategic map, steps 1, 2, and 3. If you take a look at the exhibit that talks about the strategic thinking map, step 1, It lays out there for you a charted way for you to put on paper the ability to identify your strengths and weaknesses as an organization. You note in that exhibit they divided up into 3 distinct blocks that talk about pre-service, point of service, and after service. In other words, what do our strengths and weaknesses look like before we go into the process of offering products, goods, and services to our customer base or our patients? What happens when they're at the point of service and actually accessing care and buying things from us? And then what happens after that service has actually taken place and delivered patient care to patients, products, goods, and services. That gives us a good idea of what our strengths and weaknesses are relative to our service delivery aspects. And then if we couple that with our culture, our structure, and our strategic resources, these are support activities that also can help us to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the organization. So that is step 1. You put all those things together in step 1 of your strategic thinking map. That leads you to step 2. This exhibit, step 2, will help you to evaluate competitive relevance of strengths and weaknesses. And they talk about whether or not we are providing any value to our, through our products, goods, and services to our patients. Is what we are doing rare? Is it imitable? In other words, are people able to copy it and do the same thing for a lesser cost? Most importantly, is it sustainable? Is what we are doing to fight off the competition relevant to the strengths and weaknesses of our organization? So by looking at our value and whether it's rare and whether it's imitable or whether it's sustainable will help us to determine our competitively relative strengths and our weaknesses. So that is step 2. And then that takes us to step 3 of the strategic thinking map. This is where our focus on competitive strengths and competitive weaknesses comes right down to us being able to list out what are our competitive advantages and what are our competitive disadvantages, and put them side by side and determine what there is that we can do about them to make the advantages work to our benefit, and make sure that we can limit the disadvantages that we've identified as something that we can potentially fix and try to remove from the analysis that we're conducting that will help us to put on paper in a strategic plan for the future how well that we're going to be able to be a successful healthcare organization. Now, relative to being able to ask ourselves, evaluate and how we're going to evaluate the internal strategic assumptions that we've been talking about as part of this process, there are 7 questions that we want to be able to ask ourselves that will help us to make those determinations. Number 1, we ask ourselves, have the strengths and weaknesses been correctly identified? And these are very closely related to the same questions we had in Chapter 3. Is there a clear basis on which to compete? Does the strategy exploit the strengths and avoid the major weaknesses of our organization? Are the competitive advantages related to the critical success factors in the service area? Have we protected our short and long-term competitive advantages? Has the competition made strategic moves that have weakened our competitive advantages? And 7, are we creating new competitive advantages that are going to work to our benefit? So again, those are listed for you as the exhibit in Chapter 4. Important information that the authors feel that it's important for you to take a look at and be able to ask yourself these 7 questions, which again will help kind of bring full circle the analysis that you're doing of the internal organization for which we're doing analysis in the first place. And as with the other chapters of the textbook, make sure that you take a look at the key terms that are listed at the end of this chapter. Starts with the key terms of after service and ends up with weaknesses. And all of those terms that are listed in between, if you can kind of etch an understanding of definition of each of these terms in your mind, that will help you better understand what it is that we're talking about in Chapter 4, and that's conducted analysis of the internal environment. So anyway, that pretty much brings full circle Chapters 3 and 4. We talked about the service area competitive analysis in Chapter 3, and in Chapter 4, internal environmental analysis and competitive advantage. Both of those things come hand in hand, or come on the heels of doing the external analysis of the organization we talked about last week. So, you did some really good work during week 2 that just got done grading, so Keep up the good work, and if you have any questions, you need to contact me. Shoot me an email or call me on the telephone. And if I don't hear from you, I'll be watching your discussion board interaction again this week, looking for some strong appearances like you have done in the first 2 weeks of the course. So thanks for joining me for this session, and if I don't hear from you, I'll see you next week, week 4, with another video presentation. Thanks for your attention.